Why do the peace talks on Ukraine keep stalling? Why do our leaders in all the countries involved keep letting us down in the move from war to peace? We would all like to see an end to the fighting, an end to all the suffering of all the countries involved. But why do the peace talks keep stalling? Here's what everyone's missing, I think. There's not a proper process to move from war to peace. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. How do we move from war to peace in a conflict as complex with as many root causes as the conflict in Ukraine? My name's Jeff Rich. I'm a historian, writer and ex-government official, and I've been following the Russia-Ukraine NATO war for several years now and commenting intermittently on it on my YouTube channel. Last week I produced a video that looked at the deadlock in Ukraine, the Ukraine peace negotiations, and I talked about it as a 5-state war. And in this video, I want to build on that and build on the insight of Colonel Jacques Beau in one of his recent interviews. Colonel Jacques Beau, the highly respected Swiss intelligence officer, military intelligence officer who's written a book, The Russian Art of War, and is one of the leading commentators and most expert commentators on the Russia-Ukraine NATO war, has said that the way of thinking about the war and the negotiation of the peace needs to change. It's not simply one-off events. It's a process, and a process of negotiation. So I had a little bit of a think about the framework I set out in last week's video based on that insight, and did a little bit of research myself into what are some models of resolving complex conflicts like this and moving from war to peace. And I want to set some of that out here, as well as outline a simple 3-step framework that will underpin my subsequent videos looking at the ways in which each of the 5 states involved, Russia, the Ukraine, the USA, the European Union and Britain, are going about resolving the conflict, moving from war to peace. So a couple of the key ideas I presented in that previous video was essentially 3 main ideas. One, it's a 5-state war. It's not just between Russia and Ukraine, and therefore the conflict to be resolved needs to pay attention to the needs of all the parties involved. The second key idea I had was that governments, executives, states like Russia, like the USA, are what people call divided executives. I used the example of World War I to illustrate this, but it's abundantly clear today that within states or like governments like the United States, or indeed Ukraine, or indeed Europe, there are divided opinions about how to conduct the war and to negotiate the peace. Different objectives, different interests, and different approaches, as well as different, I guess, personalities, aptitudes, skills, and factions. And this has a big bearing on the negotiation of the conflict, as we'll see later in the video. And then the third idea, of course, was this idea that we're not in a peace-building phase, we're in a war termination phase. That certainly, I think, Russia and the United States are America, less clearly Ukraine, and the European Union and Britain have reached a point where they want to bring an end to the war. However, they want to bring an end to the war on their terms, rather than, I guess, in a negotiated just settlement for all the parties involved. And that's why we're in this sort of trap, I guess, at the moment of diplomacy, that I guess Donald Trump is, if you like, attempting to coerce a peace, to sort of will a peace into being, to call a summit, to do a deal between him and another president, and declare the peace, even though other parties involved in the conflict are not involved and have different ideas about what needs to be done to build a lasting peace, let alone actually end the war. So it's particularly that last phase I want to build on in this video, and present a simple framework to try to understand this process of moving from war to peace based on some genuine academic research. I'm going to outline that to you now. The first thing to bear in mind is people talk about a wave, a conflict wave that begins with latent conflict. Latent conflict, let's say that is the situation in Ukraine before 2014, where there's tensions between Russia, Europe, United States, etc., but no strong conflict. And then there's a period of conflict emergence, let's say that is 2014, that then escalates into incidents of violence, perhaps as occurred between 2014 and 2022, and then ultimately the intensity and the battles of war. And then the conflict wave starts cresting down into de-escalation and negotiation, ultimately conflict settlement, and then right at the bottom we get peace building at the end, the sort of post-conflict life, peace development. In reality, of course, this wave probably has ups and downs all along the way, but you get the fundamental idea. And as this wave works its way through, there are factors pushing for war, let's say, conflict exacerbation people talk about, such as polarisation, such as trying to entrap people in certain situations, such as unilateral demands or other forms of escalation, such as supplying more and more dangerous weapons to one or other party of the conflict. And you also have conflict mitigation factors, de-escalation, demilitarisation, demobilisation, mutual understanding, peace talks, engaging in dialogue with the other side. And over time, these two dynamics sort of push the conflict wave in different directions. And it basically leads, I guess, to like you can imagine it as a 4-grid box where there's positive and negative change on one axis, conflict exacerbation and conflict mitigation on the other axis. And this gives us various stages of warfare, of coerced peace, of non-conflict, non-violent conflict waging, strategic competition, I guess, in Joe Biden's terms, and then ultimately genuine conflict settlement and peace. So those 4 boxes are pretty important and define the stages we're at. I guess at the moment we're sort of moving somewhere erratically between warfare, coerced peace, and, people starting to talk about conflict settlement. But let me just show you a different way of visualising this process now. So I'm going to show you this simple process now of moving from war to peace, just as a way to highlight perhaps where we're at now and give people a clearer framework for understanding what's going on. In fact, this shows us the whole arc from the initiation of conflict through to its resolution. So the first box is what we have here called latent conflict. And here we are again, let's think Ukraine between 2004 and 2014. Issues are starting to crystallize, but not breaking out into the next stage, which is overt conflict, actual physical clashes. Again, we can think of this stage as, I guess, the period from 2014, or if you prefer, from 2022, where there's a more explicit conflict between Russia and Ukraine rather than, I guess, the internal conflict within Ukraine itself. So here we see the actual direct confrontation. And this is very much the stage in which we are now. Now, often American geostrategists talk about a thing they call frozen conflict. And I guess, if you like, frozen conflict is where you do get stuck in this sort of area. But that's not what we really want to do. We want to move from war to peace. We actually want to move beyond frozen conflict or overt conflict to a peace settlement between the parties. And that is stage 3, which is conflict settlement. And here, of course, what we're trying to do is conciliate between the parties, to recognise what are the causes of the conflict and what are some of the solutions to that process. And this is the critical process of negotiating peace. This is what we really need to focus on at the moment. And we're really, I would say, sort of jumping back and forward, in and out of this zone, going, like in a bad triangle between those sort of 3 boxes there. At times wanting to genuinely settle the conflict, at times falling back into overt conflict. And then finally we get to a sustainable peace, which has, genuine shared development, harmony, if you like, the kind of things China likes to talk about, but is not always so involved in this process. Now, what's crucial is here, this process here, this messy peace negotiation process, the point of how to get from war to peace has a number of different approaches that can work more or less successfully. First of all, and I've got a bit of an issue with the gardener going outside, but I hope you don't mind. But first of all, we have the bad route, if you like, of a frozen conflict or a continuing war. War or frozen conflict. But then there are different ways of negotiating a peace settlement. You can have a coerced peace, which is imposed by one party. For example, Donald Trump. One could almost describe the, Gaza peace plan, the 3,000-year peace, as such a peace. Then you have a one imposed by the victor. That is, if you like, what people talk about when they say Russia will win this on the battlefield. It will, the war will be settled on the battlefield. Usually that doesn't end too well. That means we just go back to this sort of process of latent or overt conflict a little bit further on. And then finally, one has a settlement that is joint by all parties. And this is really what we want to get to, because this is the foundation of a just and lasting peace. Now, at the moment, as I say, we're in this messy period, and the different strategies of the different factions in the different states of Russia, United States, Ukraine, Britain and Europe are all debating different ways of pursuing things, continuing the war, freezing the conflict, imposing a solution, winning it on the battlefield. But none, really, not even at the Alaska summit or the proposed Budapest summit, none as yet are really talking about a joint settlement involving all 5 parties. But in order to get there, that's what we need to do. So then the question becomes, how do we move from war to peace, and not just an imposed peace, not just a coerced peace, not just a peace imposed by victors and the gun, but a peace that is joint of all parties and addresses the root causes of all parties. And that's what I'm going to discuss in this next final section of the video that talks about my 3-step process of how we can move from war to peace. So for this part of the video, I'm going to sit down in the chair, and what I want to explain to you is how we can move, or the states involved in this conflict can move through a genuine process of conflict settlement from war to peace that takes account of the issues that I discussed in the previous video on the Ukraine deadlock, that there are divided states and that there are more than 2 states involved in this conflict. There are 5 states: USA, Russia, Europe, Britain, and of course Ukraine. Now, one can slag off at any one of those parties and say they've got no role in the peace, or they're imbeciles, or they're children, or they're warmongers, or whatever. But ultimately, unless they're engaged in a just conflict settlement, not necessarily the current individuals involved, but those states are involved in a just peace settlement, there is not going to be any genuine solution to this crisis. So how then do we do this? How do we move from war to peace in Ukraine? Well, I think there are 3 steps that we need to follow that will take us through that conflict wave and get out on the other side in a way that I think would meet the aspirations of many people around the world. And those 3 steps are to, first of all, identify responses to the root causes of the conflict. It's one thing to talk about the root causes of the conflict, to identify the root causes of the conflict, but we also need to actually identify genuine responses to the root causes of the conflict. That is, come up with options that enable us to solve the conflict, or the tensions, or the competing interests peacefully rather than through war. And then the second step in this process is a coalition needs to be built in each state involved in the war that commits and supports the peace party within the state. There are always going to be advocates of war, advocates of ambition and grandiose expansion and opportunistic violence in any state. I guess that is a sad fact of the human condition. But it is also possible for the leaders within states to build a coalition that says no to the warmongers and yes to the peace builders. And that needs to happen in each state, even if it may be on a different time frame in each state, which then dictates the peace process. And then the third step is that the sovereign authority of each state needs to act, not just talk, not just, have a big media event and, say, I've earned the right to win the Nobel Peace Prize now. Each state each sovereign authority needs to act, negotiate, and actually implement things. Russians often talk about the United States not being agreement capable, and this is an issue I'll discuss a little bit more in my video on the United States dilemmas in resolving this conflict. That is the issue, the third step that we need to come to. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about each of these steps, particularly the first step, because this is crucial, and this keeps being one of the points at which various parties are stumbling at the moment. The Russians consistently say, we need to address the root causes of this conflict. A ceasefire is not a peace because it's not addressing the root causes of this conflict. So what are the root causes of the conflict, and how do you develop effective responses to it? Now, in this respect, I think it's useful to refer to the work of historian Richard Overy. Why do people conduct wars? What are root causes of war? It turns out it's a pretty complex picture. One can say simplistically, well, the root cause is Russian imperialism or NATO expansion eastward, or the internal domestic policies of Ukraine that deprive Russian language citizens of basic human and civil rights. But are they the right categories with which to think about the fundamental root causes of the conflict? And is there one root cause of the conflict or many? And you also need to think about the causes of the conflict for each party involved. There's the perspective of Russia, who will talk about the root causes of the conflict, but what are the root causes of the conflict from an American perspective, or a Ukrainian perspective, or a British or European perspective? You will get different answers, and in a way, one needs to deal with compromise responses to all of those different issues. So when Richard Overy talks about the root causes of the conflicts, he talks broadly about, if you like, things that are within our nature, biology, human psychology, the natural environment, those kind of things, and 4 broad categories of motives for war that are, fundamental explanations for causes of war. And these help us identify a little bit more clearly with each state what some of the root causes of the conflict really are. Those 4 categories are resources, things like, the oil, the money, the territory, the ports, the minerals, all that sort of thing. A second category is belief, the ideology, the sense of national identity, a sense of liberal values, of civilizing mission, of, crusading purpose, of belief in God, and various historical narratives that shape those beliefs. And thirdly, there is power, status, dominance, hegemony, prestige, and those kind of things. And then finally, there is the issue emphasised predominantly by realist scholars, which is security, protection from and responses to threats from indecipherable foreign actors. How do you ensure there's, a collective security arrangement or buffer zones or no threat posed to your state? So if you look at those four broad categories, leaving aside some of the human psychology things, our tendency to, create them versus us narratives, which are certainly a factor in this war. But those four categories are a little bit more actionable, I guess, in terms of peace negotiation. We can identify root causes of the conflict. You can see it. For example, we can see there's clearly Ukraine is a significant economic resource in Europe, an economic zone with rare earths and fertile earth and all those kind of things. So there's a resources issue. There's a belief issue in terms of, Ukraine belongs in Europe. The Ukrainian nation needs to realise itself, or liberal values against the autocracies of Russia. There's a power issue. Will America assert its global dominance around the world? And there is clearly also a security issue, I guess, for Ukraine, for the Eastern European states, and obviously so for Russia. All of these are clearly fundamental factors. And the point is, there are multiple root causes of the war, and well-conducted peace negotiations need to develop options to deal with them. Now, I'm going to look at some of those options a little bit more in my videos on each of the individual 5 states involved in this conflict. But that, I think, is the key thing to focus on in looking at both the motives for war and potentially the motives for peace, because each of those 4 factors, resources, belief, security, and power, perhaps less so power, can also be, accommodations can be made. You can find indivisible security. You can agree that no one is the boss, that, there's a shared distribution of power in the world. You can agree to trade resources rather than raid resources, and you can modify your beliefs so they become less evangelical, less crusading, and less generative of conflict. The second step in my 3-step process to move from war to peace in Ukraine is that all the states involved need to build coalitions within their own states to overcome the factional feuding and the division of the executive in which the peace party prevails. One can clearly see this at play in the United States of America with, it has a significant number of hawks and neocons and all that kind of stuff who compete for attention amongst the people who may be advocating a more peaceful path. But the same applies in all of the other states. There are competing voices within Russia who argue for more intense and aggressive escalation of the conflict. But to get to a genuine conflict settlement, one needs to focus on genuine coalition building within each of these states. The peace party needs to prevail. And the jury's out as to how that is going in each of these 5 states right now. I would say in Russia, on the whole, the peace party is prevailing in the sense of keeping open the door to negotiations with the United States while still pursuing the objectives of the military operation. And it's less clear what's going on in Europe, in Britain, and Ukraine and the United States. But these things can change rapidly in response to events, in response to different calculations of the feasibility of victory. And I will examine that in response to unfolding events in my subsequent videos on each of the 5 states. But what I'd really like to emphasise is there are a couple of fundamental things that need to be done for this coalition building, for this peace process to prevail. First of all, recognise there are many voices in foreign policy, and just because there's a think tank somewhere to outline one thing doesn't mean that is the only voice going to the key decision makers. Not assuming that there is a cabal there somewhere, that there is no discussion about the different prospects and different options. If one wants to commit to peace, one has to find the peacemakers within each government, and they are there. How are their voices going to be strengthened? The second thing is you need to have genuine, effective strategic decision making within the state. There are many voices in foreign policy. There are always people advocating war. There needs to be a process to resolve those internal conflicts effectively. This is one of the major concerns, I would say, about the United States that I will address in my next video on the United States. There's not necessarily an effective, what one would call cabinet or decision-making process going on in the United States right now that overrides interests and emotional concerns of the ardent voice, the institutional voices of the military and war hawks within the US government to actually commit to a process of peace. And finally, of course, there's the politics of it as well. The leaders need to be able to make the case that they can still win their elections or maintain their political support internally while making a case for peace. This is a factor in Russia, it's a factor in Europe, it's a factor in the United States. So I'll explore all of that a little bit more in the next 5 videos. Then the third and final step in my 3-step process to move from war to peace in Ukraine is the sovereign authority of each state needs to decide, needs to commit, and needs to negotiate. There's a real question of capability of that sovereign authority that needs to be focused on here. And here again, referring to my earlier video on the deadlock in the Ukraine peace negotiations, I introduced the idea of contested sovereignty. It was a key issue in World War I. The sovereign of Russia, the sovereign of Germany appeared to be a single autocrat, but there were people within the institutions of government who found their own space for decision making. So in order to commit to peace, in order to commit to a process with another sovereign authority, that sovereign authority kind of needs to decide and act as one. It needs to assert its authority to decide, to not flip-flop one day, to the next in terms of what is, appealing. And they need to be able to implement their commitments. The other parties to the negotiation need to say, well, if you make an agreement with me, demonstrate to me that you will actually do it. And finally, each sovereign authority needs to deal with the reality that in any government there is power and resources distributed widely. different actors, to different institutions, both within and outside government. This is often misunderstood as the deep state or the powerful interest, the cabal driving the real sovereigns are just puppets, but in reality it's a phenomenon of distributed power. The president does have a lot of power, but he's not totally unilaterally powerful. He needs to act in a way that brings along the distributed power of the governments. So these are the three processes that will bring us from war to peace in Ukraine. So let me just sum up what we've talked about today. We've talked about the importance of a good process of peace building, of conflict settlement, a process for peace in order to deliver a peace. And that has been studied by people. It's many different variants of the study, but we are at the moment, it seems, trapped somewhere between overt conflict and a move into conflict settlement. There are different paths to go down in terms of conflict settlement. Some, such as imposing a coerced peace or winning on the battlefield, are ultimately unsuccessful. They just push off the conflict to a later time. But if we want to genuinely resolve the conflict, and people of goodwill around the world surely do, then we need to find a way to build a lasting settlement, a just and fair peace involving all the participants of the conflict, not just the great powers, not just the most powerful ones, not just the ones we like, but all of the parties involved. But that will require changes within those parties. They need to address the root causes of the conflict. They need to commit to the peace party within their states. And finally, they need to back up that commitment to peace within their states to a real implemented action plan that they implement against internal resistance, against conflicting interest, against the sort of weaker sides of our nature, in order to deliver genuine peace and to move through the conflict wave onto an ongoing peace process. I honestly believe that with the right guidance, people can go that way. There are many obstacles to that. And right now, I don't think we're quite sort of really hitting the mark. It may be for some time yet that we will continue to go through this process, but I will keep commenting on this in my next series of videos where I talk about the United States, Russia, Britain, Europe, and finally Ukraine, and how they are going through this process of moving from war to peace in Ukraine. Thanks so much for watching.